which glass to clink when. Well, it's a great pleasure for me and a privilege to be here today at GrowthNet. This is, I think, the inaugural session of this event. And I think we have a terrific cast of characters led by our National Security Advisor, who is well known to, I think, probably everybody here, Mr. Shankar Menon. I think the rules of the game indicate that I must give him, despite his being known, I should give a very short introduction. He's been our National Security Advisor in India since, I believe, January 2010. That's more than 3 years. And before that, he was Foreign Secretary, head of the Ministry of External Affairs for another 3 years, which were very crucial for our foreign policy, as most of you will remember and appreciate. And before that, he served as Ambassador and High Commissioner in a number of very important and sensitive posts, including Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. I won't go over all the rest of his very impressive bio, just to say that he is fluent in English. It was proven to me just now, once again, at the table when he and Ronnie Chan spoke in English, and I complimented Ronnie on his Malayalam. And Mr. Menon is also, you might be interested to know, has a graduate degree in ancient history. So he's very well suited for the discussion today. Let me take this opportunity to again introduce somebody else who's very well known to all of you, Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, who is, of course, the founder, president of the Economic Strategy Institute. Under his leadership, I think the ESI has gone from strength to strength. Mr. Prestowitz has played key roles in achieving congressional passage of NAFTA some years ago, and in shaping the final content of the Uruguay round, as well as providing the intellectual basis for US trade policies currently towards Japan, China, and Korea. Once again, there's a lot more to be said about him, which I will not take the time, a valuable time, use it up that way. He, of course, writes regularly for a number of publications, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fortune, and Foreign Affairs, and he's written a number of best-selling books on national security issues and public affairs. With that, I will take my seat. I will invite Mr. Menon to lead off with 20 minutes or so of remarks on the subject of our session, which, of course, is national security views on anything you like. And then we'll have a discussion.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you very much for that introduction. It just proves he's a friend, that's all. Don't believe a word he says. Mr. Prestowitz, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for asking me to speak here to this conference. It's a wonderful initiative that you've actually taken in getting together this group of people. It gives us a chance to exchange ideas at a time when I think the world is probably changing faster than it ever has changed before in recorded history, and also a time when it's clear that we face pretty fundamental changes, since there's no going back to the pre-crisis world, the pre-2008 world that we knew in the past. I was asked to speak on national and economic security, and I wasn't quite sure what I could say to an audience like this about it until I saw recently Foreign Policy magazine did a survey of military experts, 71 military experts, and asked them what is the greatest threat to national security. And an overwhelming majority of them said economic crisis. Ahead of regional wars or crises, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, cyber war, global warming, and pandemics, in that order. So you see the fear that you invoke in people. No, but I mention it because it's now almost a truism. I think it's commonly accepted that economic security is really one of the most significant elements of national security. And like all truisms, in order to survive, there has to be enough truth in it for it to gain currency. I mean, it's clear for us, in India at least, when we start looking at our security, we have over time expanded our definition of security to include economic security as a necessary basis for national security. From our point of view, one of the overwhelming things that strikes us is that we face actually a resource-constrained world where only the better use of the Earth's resources will allow us to meet the development aspirations of a world that pretty soon is going to have to support something like 8.2 billion people. Today, for us, when we list our economic security priorities, we have energy security, food security, resource security, and technology security, which we regard as essential components of our national security calculus. And in each of these domains, energy, food, each of them, the calculus is changing very fast. I'll take just one example, because I'd like to actually discuss this maybe later in the question and answer. If you look at energy security, we live in an energy-constrained world, yes, so that makes, say, the Indian experience of frugal manufacture, of innovation, much more valuable if we're to use energy efficiently, conserve what we have. For instance, we now have instances of frugal agricultural practices, production processes, which dramatically reduce the use of fertilizer, and which, as you know, has a very high energy cost to it. But at the same time, we see the geopolitics of energy changing really rapidly around us, thanks to new discoveries, new technologies, hydraulic fracturing, for instance, because they change the entire energy map of the world and the prospects. If you look at the effects of this, it's really most pronounced for the emerging economies. Today, you have a completely new situation where among the emerging economies themselves, there are technologies and resources available which can help us towards our goals of energy security. Some cutting-edge work on solar, on other renewable energy sources, and the markets that allow their commercial exploitation are actually available in emerging economies. But fortunately, there is a fundamental difference between traditional hard security issues and these sorts of economic security issues. While hard or traditional security issues are primarily and largely zero-sum games, economic security is not. Trade, economic cooperation which enhance economic security do not necessarily offer only win or lose choices, and there can be several or multiple simultaneous gains for multiple actors across the economic security calculus. And that makes a big difference to the way we can approach it. There is one other complication which I think we need to recognize. Today we live in an age of heightened expectations. Simple example, our grandfathers expected to grow old, weak, and sick. Today, our generation expects perfect health at all ages, and we then raise the cost of healthcare because we try and cure every single disease all the time. It's the same with security. Previous generations took it for granted that life was Hobbesian, poor, nasty, short, brutish. Today, we even expect the government to fix the weather. A few years ago, some post-industrial, postmodern societies introduced a resolution in the Security Council saying that climate change is a threat to international peace and security. It is. It will change our security calculus. But whether the Security Council is going to be able to do anything about it, I have my doubts. I mean, it shows an expectation of government, of interstate organizations, which is unique. But at the same time as you have rising expectations and a much broader definition of security, the ability of the traditional provider of security, the state, to actually provide this, to meet this, is declining. And that's happening for several reasons. So we face this paradox, rising expectations and diminishing capacity, both at the same time. The state's capacity to actually provide security is diminishing because power is being diffused both within the state and between states. The state's monopoly of violence, which historians will tell you was a bit of a political science myth, but the fact is that that monopoly of violence, which is a characteristic of the unfettered sovereignty of a Westphalian state and Westphalian sovereignty, that has been broken by new technologies. You look at ICTs, you look at other technologies and the spread of knowledge, which empower small groups, individuals, to take on the state and to actually wreak effects out of all proportion to their numbers. We've seen repeated instances of this in the security calculus over the last few years, wherever you look. Now, this is irrespective of whether they seek good or bad. I mean, the technology is value neutral. It can be used by NGOs for good. It can be used by humanitarian groups for good. It can be used by terrorists. It's not. So when we speak then of rising expectations, diminishing capacity, and an expanded definition of security, what do? How do we then address issues like energy security, food security, resource security? I think the only way is to find new and better ways of ensuring that, of finding new partnerships between countries, between governments and businesses and civil society and academia, because otherwise there is no way that we're going to be able to meet these sorts of challenges. To my mind, emerging economies need to take the lead in this effort because they are potentially the most affected by a resource-constrained world that we face. There is much that we can do. If you look at the emerging economies, there is a great deal. After all, for the first time in several centuries, emerging economies now account for more than 50% of global economic growth, about 40% of global investment. And this in itself creates possibilities to fight protectionism, to maintain an open, rule-based trading system, and to further the global economic security agenda. I do hope that you will be able to help us to do so, because this is a gathering of economic movers and shakers from around the world. So I wish you luck in your discussions and look forward to a much more detailed discussion in the discussion that follows with Clyde, Prestowitz, and in the question and answers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Whoops. So, Clyde.
Yes. Let me just follow that with a few brief comments and maybe some questions. I think it is telling that Minister Menon spoke about the significance of economics and the significance of resource limitations as national security issues. And just to emphasize that, recently the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces commented that the biggest U.S. national security problem is the U.S. national debt. I find that very interesting because it seems to me that in a way what all of this suggests is in some sense a bit contrary to a lot of the thinking that that we have associated with globalization over the past 25 or 30 years. In much of the global community, we have had a kind of a mantra over that period in which we say that globalization will increase global wealth, it'll make everybody rich, As countries become rich, they will become democratic. And as they become democratic, they will become peaceful, because we say that democracies do not go to war against each other. Think about that for a moment, and then think about some of the elements that we know are present at the moment. We know that globalization, and particularly technological development that underpins globalization, has enabled the kind of proliferation of threat that Minister Menon mentioned. We know that the ability of the state to monopolize violence and to control security has been reduced because of globalization. We know that globalization can make countries rich, and that can make them powerful, and that can enable them to do things in terms of responding to what they perceive as threats, or in terms of working off old hostilities that may be anything but peaceful. And so it's not clear that globalization will automatically lead to peace and nirvana, which only emphasizes then the significance of considering many of the issues that we have been accustomed to thinking of as trade issues or financial issues or technology issues as national security issues. And particularly, I think, as we look forward and think about the projections of global economic growth, last night in one of the sessions, it was pointed out that the U.S. 10 years ago accounted for about 25% of global economic output, and within another 10 years, that'll be down to 15%. The U.S. also spends a bit over 50% of the world's spending on national security. Clearly, that rate of U.S. spending is not sustainable if the economic projections are anywhere near accurate. And so that suggests also very dramatic changes in the global security alignment. And then finally, we have recently been talking about, we talk about trade wars, we talk about the rise of protectionism, particularly in recent, last couple of years, we've talked about currency wars. And we think of these as, we use the term war, as a kind of an exaggeration. When you talk about a currency war, you don't really expect anybody to get killed. But in fact, maybe currency wars are real wars. Maybe trade wars are real wars, or they can lead in the direction of real wars. And so all of this suggests that the definition of national security needs to be expanded. But if it is, it then also suggests a whole different approach to global economic negotiations. If the U.S. debt is the biggest national security risk to the United States, it's also a national security risk to America's allies, which means then that they have a real interest in how the U.S. handles its debt problem. They have a national security interest in how the U.S. handles its debt problem. And that then makes the nature of the economic discussion a much more serious and far-reaching one, I believe. And I'd like to turn that to our panel here and see if I have aroused any agreement or contention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clyde. Shankar, may I request you to take up one or two of the points that Clyde has made. One, if I heard him right, that he was drawing attention to this automatic kind of nice path to nirvana from globalization to world peace or something like that. Though I suppose if one were more of an optimist, one might say that the 50, 60 years of globalization that we've seen since the Second World War has at least kept world wars at bay. But maybe that's an optimistic view. But leaving that aside, I mean, that's a view which I wonder what you think about that. Sort of he went on to say something which was a little counter to your distinction between hard security and these other security issues, where he felt that trade and currency wars, for example, could also lead to possibly, hopefully not, but possibly, to real wars. So very helpful to have your views on these points, if you'd like to, or anything else.
Well, I think, you know, if you look at it from our point of view, I mean, it's clearly we're beneficiaries of globalization and global interdependence over the opening up of the international trading system. Over the last 2 decades, we've done well out of it. And I think that's true of most emerging countries. They wouldn't be emerging if they weren't doing well out of it. So, yes, I don't think we have any reason empirically to say that that was wrong. All I'm saying is that we're today in a different world. We're in a world where, I mean, how do you put this? The father of the international, open, multilateral international trading system, in terms of what was done after World War II, is today talking about TPP, about TIPP, transatlantic, trans-Pacific partnerships. You're seeing increasingly people turning towards local, regional arrangements. Now, I'm not sure you can therefore assume that we're going to go on seeing the same kind of globalization that we saw before. If so, that has national security impacts on societies which maybe took that for granted and assumed, therefore, that they'd have a certain growth path available to them, which, now it has both domestic and international consequences, but I'm not sure I'd go as far as you did, then to say that trade wars become real wars. I even have trouble when people say that water is going to lead to wars. I mean, I can't think of an example in history where that actually worked. But maybe there was, I don't know. But I think what it does have is it has kinetic effects in societies and in states which can then lead to making it easier to go to war. But, you know, that's a huge different argument. It's like revolutions. Revolutions don't happen when things are at rock bottom. They happen when things are improving and people have the time and space to actually think about how much better they could be. It's the same thing with wars. They don't actually happen when, you know, the actual clash of interests is that bad. But that's a whole different part of a whole different theory, and you'll get a big argument. But currency wars turning into real wars, how do you see that happening? I mean, how do you see that?
Well, you mentioned yeah. TPP, and I think that if you ask what's driving TPP, it's primarily not economics. It's not about trade. Mm-hmm. It's much more about the balance of power between the U.S., well, I would say between China and many of the other countries in the Asia-Pacific region. The TPP has been promoted by countries like Singapore, for example, who want the U.S. to be a counterweight to China as part of their own national security strategy. The White House Deputy National Security Advisor Mike Froman has explained that TPP is a way for America to demonstrate that it's back in the Asia-Pacific region. Well, what does that mean? It means it's part of the U.S. policy of the pivot to Asia. But the pivot to Asia is a geopolitical policy primarily, not an economic or trade policy. So I think you could look at TPP as more geopolitical and more strategic than economic. And to the extent that China sees this as an attempt to contain China, it conceivably can lead to confrontation and conflict.
But you see a trade war turning into a hot war, into a...
Well, I don't see a trade war maybe directly turning into a hot war, but I can see that policies or negotiations that are labeled trade or labeled economic actually have a very significant geopolitical dimension, a national security dimension. And that national security dimension then clearly doesn't have to, but it may lead in the direction of confrontation and even of conflict. Let's think of another example. I mean, China and Japan right now are having a very nasty conflict over the Senkaku Islands. That has occurred at the same time as there have been incidents in China regarding Japanese facilities and Japanese production capabilities in China. So the trade element of the China-Japanese relationship has become tied into a geopolitical circumstance that could become quite difficult. The United States has a security commitment to Japan. I don't think it will happen, but theoretically, there certainly is the possibility that the U.S. would be called upon by Japan to fulfill its commitment with regard to the Senkaku Islands. Or even think of something even more bizarre, but the U.S. has security commitments to Korea and also to Japan. Japan and Korea are also engaged in a bitter dispute over the Takashima Islands. So this has the potential for the U.S. to go to war with itself. But it kind of builds from an economic base.
Shankar, may I take a chance to pick up one of your other themes of your remarks and to sort of press you a little more on that, perhaps, if I may, which is that I think you said that one of the phenomena we are seeing is the heightened expectations because of all the things that have happened in terms of network connectivity and all that, for security in its many dimensions. And yet that comes at the same time as you put it, that the traditional provider of security, namely the state, is in relative terms getting weaker and weaker. And you hoped that this paradox could be solved through partnerships between the state, business, and civil society. And you felt that perhaps the emerging countries could take a lead in this. And that's the part that slightly puzzled me, or at least intrigued me, because would it not be fair to think about civil society and business, at least, in today's world, still perhaps being more developed in the old developed countries than in the new emerging ones? Or is that an unfair thing?
Well, I wouldn't say, I think those distinctions, I don't think you would say just emerging countries or just developed countries or industrialized countries. I think it'll have to cut across the lines. I think the difference is today emerging countries have certain capabilities that they didn't have before, whether in terms of technology, in terms of capital, in terms of resources, which they now have access to. And so they can actually be part of a real partnership, which maybe 30 years ago, if you tried to do it, what you said was true. I mean, the balance of knowledge, resources, capital, everything was really on one side. But that's no longer true. So today you can actually build those partnerships. The problem is that the states themselves might not have the same kind of interest. I mean, you look at, energy again. I mean, we've sort of taken it for granted for the last 40, 50 years that the West has an interest in maintaining the stable flow of cheap oil from the Middle East to the rest of the world. And the rest of us are all beneficiaries of this, actually, in a sense. That's much less so if the West has its own sources of oil, gas, and if what comes out of the Middle East is much less important to them. So then who is actually going to either put in place the arrangements? I don't think there are emerging country states who can do this anymore, but there would have to be other kinds of arrangements made where you need industry, you need local regimes, you need whatever, but you need a whole different way of guaranteeing that energy supply, because it is still important, no matter what. It's still going to be around 16, 20% of world oil supplies in all the projections. So all I'm saying is you need a new way of doing this, which I'm not sure, unless we start thinking of it, try our luck, see, some might work, some might not. Otherwise, we run a real risk.
Right. Clyde, any thoughts on this issue of who provides sort of global public goods in a sense, and how?
Well, I completely agree with the Minister's comments that the shift in some of the economic assumptions that we've had for a long time has dramatic security implications. With the U.S. essentially becoming energy independent and therefore much less dependent on the Middle East, on the Gulf region for its own energy security, and at the same time having this significant debt problem. The easy road is obviously to spend less and not be as concerned about the security, but as he said, that doesn't mean that there aren't other countries that are very dependent on the Gulf region. So I think where it goes is I was very struck by Dr. Supachai's comments this morning. You know, I remember from my history classes, Norman Angell wrote a book, I've forgotten the title of it, but it was just before World War I. And many of you know that the global economy was more integrated, more globalized in 1914 than it was again until about 1998. And in 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, Norman Angell wrote this book arguing that war would be impossible because it would be so destructive to the global economy. But that didn't stop war from happening. And if we look at the situation in the 1930s, before the outbreak of World War II, we had a situation in which there were competing preferential trade agreements. This morning, Dr. Supachai made the point that we're negotiating now lots of so-called free trade agreements. TPP, Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, or CEP. Everybody calls these free trade. They're not free trade, they're preferential. The members of those agreements will have better deals with the other members than they will with non-participants in the agreements. The whole point of the agreement is that certain countries get a special deal. That's not a free trade agreement. That's a preferential trade agreement. That's what we had in the 1930s. We're beginning, Dr. Supachai mentioned this morning, the issue of currencies, and particularly of special drawing rights, and the history of, the sad history of special drawing rights. But what are we beginning to see now? We're beginning to see countries intervening in currency markets on a regular, sustained basis. These are currency wars. We saw that in the 1930s. And it was to avoid that we established the World Bank and the IMF and the GATT and then the World Trade Organization. And yet, it seems to me you could make the argument that we're witnessing something of a repetition of those phenomena, which argues for, I think, Dr. Supachai's point this morning that we desperately need better global governance mechanisms, and we need the major powers and I think very importantly, the developing powers to be aiming at a very active and specific direction toward affecting better global governance mechanisms.
Thank you, Clyde. Well, Mr. Menon will have to, I know, leave in 5 minutes, and perhaps we can allow the last 5 minutes for a couple of questions from the audience. I believe there's a roving mic somewhere. If you can just put up your hand and I can identify you, and mic. Right at the back there. And please, when the mic does come to you, And identify yourself before you ask the question, so it's helpful. Right at the back there. Hand is up. Keep your hand up.
Thank you. This is Shashank Tripathi. My question is to Mr. Menon. In our lifetimes, let's say the next 30 years, what are the chances that India and China will go to war?
That's an easy one.
I think very, very, very little. It's not in either side's interest. And I assume that, a combination of 8,000 years of statecraft should be good enough to take care of that problem.
I hope that satisfies you. Yes, question here in the front table.
Throughout this conference, Sonia
could you just identify? I'm sorry.
Sonia Shukla is my name.
Right.
And throughout this conference, everybody has been talking about how emerging powers or emerging markets like India should play a greater role in creating a new global order. Do you think that India is ready to take on a greater role? What could that role be? Would you tell us something?
I think we've just had a discussion about whether you have global solutions to these problems or not, and whether it's possible or not. If you have diminished state capacity, if you have a situation where states are so involved with their domestic issues that they're actually getting into competitive devaluations, into all kinds of, and the things that you mentioned, trade wars you're setting up, then I'm not sure that you're in the right state of mind to actually build a wonderful new global order, no matter how necessary it is. In which case, what you're looking for is solutions to individual problems, the best that you can get. There, I think emerging countries today have the capacity and actually the need to get involved in. But building a whole new world, one wonderful global order, it's attractive and it's intellectually easy, but it's practically, I think, impossible. And I don't think we should even try it at this time. The last time you managed it, the whole world had been wiped out, except for one huge dominant power, who then made an order which everybody saw was in their interest. And that, I'm not sure that in today's situation, it's good intellectual exercise, but I'm not so sure that you can actually do that. Look at the trouble we have making existing institutions work, existing international institutions. Which is why, for me, it's seamless, whether it's economic issues or national security issues. And I think you really need to take a much more practical approach to it. Each one calls the other one irresponsible if he doesn't do what he wants them to do. I mean, this is the state of play today in the world. When people say emerging countries should become responsible powers, what do they mean by responsible? Responsible to whom? Each government is primarily responsible to its own voters, its own constituencies, and will keep doing this. And in today's situation, it's hard to see that capacity exists to build a global order that will actually last and work. I'm not so sure. So you see completely different solutions being applied in different parts of the globe to the same kinds of national security issues.
Thank you, Shankar. Well thought. Yeah, last one, please.
Yes, Claude Smadja. I am very intrigued by one thing. We mentioned, quite rightly in my mind, that even if the US becomes self-sufficient in energy, we still have a heavy dependency on the oil coming from the Gulf. And this dependency will become even more acute for countries like China, India, to some extent Europe. At the same time, we are facing a very paradoxical situation because we know, and Clyde was right to mention that there is, and I guess there will be very little appetite in the US for military action in the future, at least for the foreseeable future. Not only because of financial constraints, but because in some ways the US is in retreat. Europe defense capabilities are declining, I would not even say by the year, but I would say by the months, when you compare even the two largest military capabilities, meaning UK and France. They have been reduced dramatically, and they will continue to be reduced. And even with a fifth grade dictatorship like Libya, Europe could not conduct a military operation on its own. It had to rely on the United States. So if we are still reliant on the Gulf, if the US will be maybe less dependable, if Europe capabilities become less and less available, how come at the same time are we crying wolf every time we see a Chinese military budget? And to what extent are we not in a situation where more and more India and China will have to expand their blue water projection capabilities, because looking down the road 15 years from now, I think if there is something happening in the Gulf, and there is a good possibility that something will happen in the Gulf, because we know that this is not the most rational area in the world, then in a way, should we not look at China's, let's say, development of military capabilities in a different light?
Claude, let me just add quickly to that Japan is in the same boat, and there's already significant discussion in Japan about expanding that military capability.
Clyde, why don't you expand a little more, because I sensed that question was addressed to both of you. So would you...
Well, on the maritime security is a good example, actually. Here's a global public good where for several years, we've all got used to a US naval presence guaranteeing freedom of sea lines of communication. And here's an issue where logically, as you said, China, India, whether it's, all the way from Suez to the Western Pacific, China, India, Japan, we all have an interest in contributing our bit and making sure that these sea lanes stay open, that trade, energy can flow freely across this whole space. And I think that's happening. I mean, we're all working together in counter-piracy off the Somali coast, and we are coordinating in practice. And I think we will, but you do, and this is to go back to her point, you don't have one-size-fits-all kind of solutions. You have different situations. When you look at the seas near China, where you have maritime disputes of various kinds going on, territorial disputes, when you look at the Western Pacific, where clearly the US is the main provider, is the provider of security, and you look at the Indian Ocean, where it's much more cooperative. So there are differences in the way it's applied. So there's no one template, but it's clear, yes, what you say is right, that I think you will find other states, but more than other states, I think ultimately to provide this kind of security in the new world, there will have to be not just states involved in this.
Then my follow-up question is, are you less alarmed about the rise of China's naval military power than the US pretends to be?
Let me tell you, we started a maritime security dialogue with China last year. And I think that's the answer.
But I think Claude has put his finger on something that's very important, which is that there is concern, not in the US, but not only in the US, about the rising Chinese military budget. And in a way, it comes back to this contradiction that I try to suggest between globalization and security. There is, on the one hand, a desire and a feeling that by engaging in trade and investment and globalization, I think it was Bob Zoellick who used the term China would become a responsible stakeholder in the global system. So there is in these globalization circles in which we travel, there is one view, which is that globalization will gradually pull all of the main players into one peaceful economic global entity. But at the same time, there are obviously tensions. The Japanese-Chinese tensions over the Senkakus are just one example. There are clearly many others. I think a question is, if there is concern, and there is obviously concern in many parts of the world, not just the US, about rising Chinese geopolitical capability, then how does that square with the continued emphasis on economic integration? I think that is a puzzle that hasn't been fully resolved, and until it is, this concern, I think, is going to be out there.
I think on that puzzle, we have to end this discussion because we promised Shankar that we'd release him at 3:45, and it's now 3:52. So thank you very much. I know there are lots of issues that people would have liked to ask you, but you've done a terrific job in opening the Pandora's box, and it's not entirely your responsibility to close it. So thank you very much, both of you, for a wonderful panel.